Hi, welcome back to the Custom Saber Shop on YouTube. My name is Rob, and today I'm going to teach you how to build a basic lightsaber with sound. Now there's 1,000 different ways to do this, but the way I'm going to show you today has a couple of advantages. It has a removable 18650 lithium-ion battery, so you can quickly change batteries rather than have to charge your saber for 3 hours. And the module will be removable, which means you can use the same soundboard in a different saber if you so choose, if you wanted to do that. For many of you that are new to saber building, this might not be an ideal first build. It might be a little too tricky. This might be a second or third type of build. If you think you're pretty handy with stuff and you're good at soldering, maybe this would be a great entry-level saber for you. So all the parts that I've used for this build are going to be listed in the description with links. So you can click on them, add to cart, click add to cart, and you could go through the shopping list and you could basically assemble all the parts that I've used for this saber. I may also include a couple links to things that are optional, and as things become available and change, we'll add that to the description as well, so you'll have a complete list in the description of this video below. For the job today, you're going to need a number of little tools. First and foremost, you're going to need a soldering iron. I recommend an ESD safe, electrostatic safe soldering iron or soldering station. You're probably going to want a hot glue gun. Again, this is an optional thing. You may be able to get away without it, but I use it. You're going to need solder, of course. These are going to be really important for soldering. It's called helping hands. These are invaluable tools. You need to get some. I use a little hobby vise for holding on to some of the components as we're soldering. If you don't have this or you don't want to get one, you can just use a carpenter's clamp or a woodworking clamp. As long as it's got these rubber ends, it can hold stuff and you can solder and work with it. You're going to want needle nose pliers. You're going to want snips that are really good and comfortable for stripping wire. You're probably going to want some kind of an X-Acto knife. As always, eye protection, very important. This is a really good little tool, a Sharpie. You use this for all kinds of things and it's easy to wipe off with methyl hydrate or whatever. And I think that's all for parts and tools. I'll probably throw in a couple more things as we go. So let's get started. Okay, so you've got all the parts listed in the description of the video and you got it out on your table and it's overwhelming. There's a lot of stuff here. So the first thing you're going to want to do is basically just lay out the parts. Now, there's heat shrink, speaker, things that we won't need right away. We just move to the outside of the electronics. You might even want to package them completely away from your workspace so you have lots of room. And just kind of break things down into groups. So if this is your first build, I'm just going to go through this really quickly. What we'll do is we'll just assemble it and we'll just test fit the parts that we've bought just to make sure it's going to go together the way we think it's going to go together. So you've got your Rebel LED here and your Rebel optic holder. They fit nicely and work together. Of course, you've got your lens, so you can go ahead and pop those things together. A lot of things are just made for each other and they snap fit. And rotate that until it drops in and it's nice and fits nice. We're going to just test fit. Place that there, this here, and we're just going to thread together the optics and the LED assembly just to get an idea of how much room we're going to have. So there's your optics assembly, there's your blade holder. It's going to go together like that. Now these are going to fit here. We want to just see how much, when these are together, how much room we're going to have between where our switch is going to go and where our heatsink is. So I always want to be mindful of what kind of space limitations we have inside the hilt. I can look through and I can see the heatsink through the hole. Here's a great time to take the switch that I've purchased and put it in the switch hole. You want to make sure that you have the right switch and the right switch hole that are going to go together. And if you'd like to watch a video explaining how that works, just click over here and we'll link to a separate video I did explaining all the different switches and switch hole options. So anyways, that one fits. That's a guarded switch, a guarded momentary. Works with the hole. I'm also going to want to check the V6 holder, which is going to house our speaker and our battery and our Nano Biscotte sound board. And I want to see, basically if I just slide this in, how much room I'm going to have. And I can look through the switch hole. I can eyeball it and see that I'm going to have about that much space between my switch and my V6 holder. Because we're going to use a wire housing harness in a really creative way, I want to be mindful of exactly how much space I have because it can get tight really quick. course, my resistor is going to go in there too. So everything's looking good. We've got the parts laid out. So basically I'm going to do this in phases or steps. And you can follow along and pause the video as you need to. So we'll get started with step one. Okay, for step one, this is really all we need because we're going to start to prep the parts. And prepping the parts basically means just little jobs that we do to the parts to ensure that they're going to work well together. And the first thing I've identified in this style of build is we're going to use a wiring harness to make the module removable. And these things go together really well. They're designed well, but the clips are really tight. So I'll probably do a close-up of these clips, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to snip these clips just so that these parts go plug in and can unplug a little more easily than they're set up for. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just snip the one side. Now I don't want to cut the clips off entirely. I just want to make them smaller. I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, I don't know if you can see, but on that side I've snipped the clips to be smaller. That's what they look like normally, and as you can see they're quite aggressive and they grab quite tight. So I'm going to snip both sides to be smaller, and then we'll proceed. Now I've snipped those clips so that there's still a little bit of the clipping mechanism. I want to test fit, and I don't want to ever pull on the wires. And the reason I'm doing this, shaving down the clips and taking the time to do that, is because I want to protect the wires. So I want to get my fingernail in there and just, there we go. It comes off. It's still nice and tight, so it's not going to fall apart while I'm sabering, but it makes it a much more effective use of the clip and the wire harness. So that's the first thing that we want to do. Now we're going to lay those aside. We'll use those a little bit later. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to prep these parts so they work well together. This is the 18650 battery holder, and this is the V6 speaker holder. It's designed to hold the speaker, the battery, and the Nano Biscotte. Now these things are a very tight fit. In fact, as they come, they probably won't fit like that. It's a limitation of the machining. All you need to do is take a knife and basically just shave down the corners. Again, I'll give you a close-up of what that looks like. You can sand them down, and you really don't need to take off that much of the corners in order to get it to fit. You want to do all four corners. That's what the corners look like normally, and that is what the corners look like after we filed it down, just that part there. And that's going to ensure that it fits properly. Now I've got all four corners shaved down, and I'm going to check positive side, the plus, on the battery holder. I always want the positive to go this way, and I want the negative to go this way. That's just the way I always do it, and I believe it's set up for that with a little marking hole. Drop it in there. There, that fits nicely. It's tight, but it's not too tight. We're going to pop that in and actually crazy glue that as we get going, but right now we're just prepping the parts. Those parts are prepped. There's one other thing I want to do to this, but it requires my hot glue gun, and it's not warmed up yet. So we're going to move right on to soldering. So we're going to start soldering. It's really still prepping these parts. So here's your wiring harness. You grab this back again. And you've noticed that on one side there's two red. Red's generally positive. And what I've already measured for you. What we're going to do is I'm going to measure off 2 squares, which is 2 inches. And if you're new to soldering, you might want to give yourself about 1/8 of an inch more. And I'm going to snip off one of those red wires. And I'm going to strip the tip about 1/8 of an inch. I'm going to twist it. We're going to get set up for soldering, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to now solder that to the positive end here. Okay, as you can see, I've already soldered a 5-inch length of, this is 28 gauge wire that I like to use. You can use 26 gauge wire as well. I've soldered a length of the wire there, 5-inch length. That's the negative, on the negative side. Before I go any further, what I want to do is I want to tin this part. And tinning is basically just pre-soldering a wire before you attach it to anything, just to keep it from fraying. You can also tin the side that you're going to attach it to. That's an option. So there's solder on there, and it makes the job slicker, easier, more effective. But before I do that, we're going to use heat shrink. Now this is the small heat shrink, I think. Yes, this is the 1/16 heat shrink, and I'm just basically going to snip myself off 2 lengths, about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little more, maybe about 3/8. The black one can go on any time because the one end of the wire is open, but the red one is going to need to go on first before we proceed, so that it's in place, because once we solder, there's no way to slide the heat shrink on. And before I want to attach that to the positive side, here's the tricky part. I'm actually going to go through the battery holder. So what I'm going to do is, just want to make sure I do this properly, I'm going to go through the hole at the end, because my clip's going to rest outside. So I basically want to go through my hole at the end, and now I want to clip this in place. These are the helping hands, are so, well, helpful. Make sure that I've got the positive end, and that's where I want to solder. I can use my helping hands to grip these guys here. I can align those up so that they're touching. Always take your time and get things nicely lined up, because if you do, you'll get a better result. I don't want to bump anything. Got my solder, and both things are pre-tinned, so it's not very much, just a simple touch and a little bit of solder. And I've got a nice shiny joint there. If the joint moves while it's cooling, it's what's called a cold joint. You might want to redo that. That's nice and solid. And I didn't forget my heat shrink, so now my shrink tube can go over that. Now you can use a blow dryer. I have a heat gun here. You can also, if you're careful and if the shrink is fairly good quality, you can brush it with your soldering iron, if it's clean, if the tip's clean, and you can get it to shrink up that way. But the best way is with a heat gun. I don't know if you're able to see that. It starts to shrink up nicely. And stick to the wire. Now I'm going to heat shrink up the black one, and then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, my glue gun's warmed up, so I can show you the last step of prepping this little part before we drop it in here. I want to point out too that I bent that the wrong way when I was making it. It actually needs to be bent back towards itself, so you want to be very, very gentle, and you don't need to bend it all the way, just a little bit. You don't want to snap these things off, just so that things fit the way they're supposed to when it drops in here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this length of ribbon. Now this is just cheap craft ribbon I got at the dollar store. I've cut a 3-inch segment, and you can heat this with a lighter on the edges so they don't fray, or you can cut it with your soldering iron if you keep the tip clean. And what we're going to do is we're going to install this ribbon so that it makes it really easy and slick to get the battery in and out. So I've got the positive end, and I figured out that I basically want to attach it here. I don't want to attach it all the way on the bottom because I want this to be able to drop in all the way to the V6 holder. So I'm going to attach it on the side, and I want to make sure it's away from this clip here, and so that it falls across, so that as my battery drops in, it allows me to pop it back out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this ribbon aside, and I'm going to get my hot glue gun that's nice and warmed up. And I've done this before, so you generally want to do this fairly quickly so your glue doesn't cool, and you only want to use a tiny, tiny bit. So you want to just use a little bit of glue, and instantly drop that in there, and press on it, and it is quite hot, so you might burn your thumb while you're doing this. I've done that lots. Just part of building a lightsaber. But if you're a wuss, you can use crazy glue or something like that that takes longer to set up. This will cool in moments. The hot glue gun is an amazing tool, so I don't want to play around with that too much. I want to let that set up, and now we're ready to drop this piece into this piece. Okay, so now we're ready to drop the battery holder into the speaker holder. Now, what we're going to do first is I'm going to place this little black wire through that hole there next to that channel. It's designed for this negative wire that goes to the battery. Now you can try to run your speaker wires through that little hole too. I don't, just because it's things tend to work better when I just run the speaker wires after the fact through, and then they'll come up this hole, as you'll see. Now before I push it in all the way, I always want to check. I want to make sure that, oh, you know what, my hot glue gun job has left a little bit of residue there. So I want to take off some of that residue so that this sits inside the speaker holder really nicely. So I'm going to take off some of that, any of that hot glue residue, so there's no bumps. And that kind of fits in nicely. That's going to go in the way I want. My wires run there. I want to take a look and see my positive wire. I want that to bend and just pop through that top hole, just like that. So I don't want to put any extra pressure on that tab that doesn't need to be there. And now, as you can see, my black wires run through that channel. I should be able to now just to press down and hear a click as these tabs engage, and that fits nice. Oops, fits nice and flush inside there and inside there. So now I've installed the battery holder. The ribbon's working, everything looks good. So now what I'm going to do next is, once I've confirmed that that's good, I'm going to take crazy glue or super glue. And I'm going to put a nice healthy dab on that tab there, and I'm going to put a dab inside that tab there. Good. And ideally you want to leave this overnight. I know it's crazy glue, it sets up fast. Double check that those are nice and pressed in there. I'm just going to set that aside. I'm going to leave it for at least a couple hours, and we'll move on to the next step. While the crazy glue is setting up on the first part, this would be a good time for you to kind of line up the parts, thread them together, figure out where you want to put your blade retention screw if you haven't ordered it with a blade retention screw. A good place for a blade retention screw on a holder like this is there or right there. You don't want to have it way out here because it's not going to get its maximum leverage. If you are looking for a video showing how to drill and tap a blade retention screw, just click here, and I'll put a link to a video that I've done showing how to do that. This is an 832 threaded hole for an 832 threaded thumb screw or blade retention screw. I'll probably just, for the purposes of this build, use a 832 socket head screw like that as a blade retention screw. Well, actually that one's a 632. Anyways, I'll get the right size for that. But 832 is also the thread I use for the CoverTech clip. So if you are, and I didn't include it in the build, there's an 832 screw. If you are putting a CoverTech clip on something like this, this is the time in the build where you want to figure out where you're going to put that, where the parts line up, and mark it, and it's drill and tap for your blade retention screw and your CoverTech screw while the crazy glue is setting up. The next step is going to be to wire up our LED. And just as a point of best practice, with the heatsink there, I always advise using the thermal tape, two-sided tape. So I've put the tape on here. You want to make sure your heatsink is clean before you install the tape. And it peeled off the one side, so haven't peeled off the second side yet. We'll do that when we get to it. Now, when ordering something like this, here's a tip. If it's only 30 cents or something like that, order 2 or 3. That way, if you're doing this for the first time, or even for the second or third time, if you screw something up, you've got another replacement part. You don't have to order or find one little thing or try to build without it. You could build a saber like this without the thermal tape. It's a really good idea for a lot of reasons. So order 2 or 3 of the cheap things just so that you have extras in case you screw it up. So I've got the thermal tape on there. You want to make sure that that's centered as much as possible because this whole thing, you take the extra time to make sure things are centered and lined up. They go together much more easily. But before we adhere the LED to the heatsink, we're going to solder the wires on here, and then we're going to adhere it. That's going to make things a little bit slicker. So I'll get it set up for that. As you can see, I've got my LED set up here, and I've already soldered the positive wire to the positive, and I want to solder the black to the negative. So what I've done is I've pre-tinned that pad. So I've held my soldering iron against it, and a little bit of solder to get it. A little bit of solder there. I'm also going to pre-tin my bit of wire that I've stripped. I'll lay that across. I'll have my soldering iron turned up fairly high because these LEDs are on a heatsink and you use heat to solder. Sometimes that takes the heat away from your soldering process. You need to warm it up a bit. As you can see, I've got a hobby vise that I put the LED in when I'm doing this. You can use basic carpenter's woodworking clamps with rubber tips, or something just to kind of hold the part. You could even, with something like this, clip it in your helping hands. You don't want to damage any electronics, so you don't want to deal with the soundboard or anything like that. But my LED is ready to install, and so what I'll do, and it helps to do this while it's still warm from soldering, is I want to go, because I've set it up this way, black and red in opposing holes, and pull all the way through, and look at that, Lines up really nice. So the wires, in fact, will help you line up your LED. So it's ready to go. So I'm going to take off my thermal tape backing. And now I'm going to very carefully, I'm going to do this once, and I want everything to line up perfectly. All the holes, which means it's centered. There we go. It's now adhered onto the heatsink. It's wired. I can take my optic, and as you'll notice, the optic, the LED with the Rebel is offset. With the Cree, it doesn't matter. So you want to make sure that your optic holder is on the right way, and it just drops in and clicks and fits. If it's on the wrong way, it'll be slightly offset, and you'll see it. You want to, whoops, I moved it. The trick is use your finger through this, put down. So what we're going to do is I'm going to keep my fingers, keeping the pressure on the optic module. You don't want to tighten this finger tight, a little more than just really good finger tight. You don't want to crush anything, but you want it to stay together. So now you have soldered a LED optic into a LED module. Now with today's high power LEDs, you don't want to hook them directly up to a soundboard. You want to use a resistor so that the LED doesn't draw too much power and interfere with the functioning of the electronics. So what's ideal for this is actually a 0.5 ohm or a 0.47 or a 0.49. I think the Custom Saber shop has a 0.47 ohm resistor. This is actually a 1 ohm resistor, 5 watt, which you can use as well. To be honest, the 0.47 will be a little bit brighter. This provides a little bit more protection, so it's a trade-off. I would go with the 0.5 ohm resistor to the 0.47. I didn't see it when I ordered these parts, and so I ordered the 1 ohm. So we're going to use that today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure about an inch, a little less. I'm going to actually cut my red wire, my positive wire, right here. And I'm going to prep both ends. We'll get to that one in a minute. I'm going to cut about 1/8 of an inch off the end of my resistor. I've also got 1/2 inch lengths of this 1/16 heat shrink. So I'm going to carefully put the heat shrink over, get it in position. These helping hands really are a lifesaver. Use your wires are getting in the way, just lay something heavy over them. So I can pre-tin that wire, but in this case, it looks good. The heat shrink's in place. I'm just going to go ahead and get some solder here. Oops, come on. I'm going to go ahead and solder this end. Looks like a really good joint. And if I don't want my heat shrink to slide around, I'll put it in position and I'll just rub it with the soldering iron. Look at that. It partially shrinks. So now that's going to stay where I put it. I can get to that later. Now I've got my my resistor soldered, the heat shrinks applied, and I've twisted the wires. It's just something I like to do with my heat gun. I actually warm them up and then twist them. That's easier to do. So that it's just for a nicer install, a better functional, more durable saber. You can do that as well. So now your LED module is ready, and we're going to essentially do the same thing now for the switch. So I'm going to pick switch color wires, and in this case, because my wire harness shows 2 green, I'm actually going to run 2 green wires to my switch, about the same length, about 10 inches, and then we'll proceed. Alright, now I've attached the wires to my LED and my switch, and basically I did the same thing with the switch as you saw me do with the resistor here. I solder the wires, heat shrink, and then warm up the wires to twist them. So I've got my switch and the wires ready, LED and the wires ready. This would be a good time also if you wanted to strip the wires at the end here and hook this up to the appropriate battery, 3.7 volt, to test the LED. Make sure it's working, that you didn't accidentally do the red on the negative and the black on the positive or something like that. Test it to make sure it works, and then we're ready to move on to the next step, which is basically installing these things inside the hilt. Alright, so what I'm going to do first thing first is so I'm basically just going to run my wires through my switch hole out into the body of the saber. Now you might be thinking, well, the battery's going to be on this end, so why not run the wires that way? Well, we want the wires to have room to curl inside the saber. And we don't always want to go the shortest path between 2 points. You want to think about how the wires are going to curve and bend. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to run the wires that way. I've got my switch washer, locking washer, and nut, which come with the switch. I'll put the locking washer on first, switch, or the nut on second. And run those into position. And this part is tricky and may take you some time. Of course, this switch sits there nicely. As you can see, I've got the nut partially threaded. I can just turn it until I don't have to go super tight. You don't need to necessarily use a pliers in here. You basically just work it until it's finger tight. And what you can do is when it gets close, put your finger on the nut, back this off a little bit so it turns your wires, and you're moving the nut with it. Now you can twist this part, and essentially that's going to tighten things up a little bit. There, and now it's no vibration, my wires are clear, my nut is in place, and my switch is ready to go. So the next thing to do is basically feed the wires back through. And like I said, you want to leave a bit of a loop. Something like that. And then your LED goes in. You want to be mindful of what side you want your resistor to go on. I want it to go on the same side as the loop with my, my switch wires. Seated in there, everything works. Blade holder goes on. I want to be mindful that I'm not turning my LED module too much while I'm installing this. Nice and tight. Now you notice that the switch doesn't line up in line with this. That's part of the design. These parts are made to show off the clocking washer setup for lining these parts up. So probably when you order your parts, the switch will be here if you've ordered this blade holder. But for the sake of this argument, that's the way this Saber is going to go together. So now I have my, essentially my front end, as I call it, ready to go. And there are my wires. You can tell there's that nice curve in those wires. It gives me some flex. So now I'm going to show you how to set up the next step.